session. I hope you are all doing okay. I think the sound of lockdown lifting for all of us living in England is something to bring some hope. And I'm really delighted to be kicking off our series on respecting human rights, of which this is the first one. And thank you very much to VE, who's sponsoring this series for us. A recorded version of the webinar is going to be available. Please do use the chat function for questions. We will have a session at the end for questions and answers. And for those of you that are just joining, welcome. I realized I sprung off the mark very promptly at 12:30, but I can see that people are still logging on. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Colleen Theron. I am the CEO of Ardea International, and I'm joined today by two fantastic speakers, Hannah Temple, who's a director at 2050. I've known for quite some time. She's a particularly skilled consultant and has been working with companies on practical solutions around human rights issues and due diligence. And I'm really looking forward to her conversation. I also want to welcome Peter Webster today, who's a senior advisor at VE. He had a period of 8 years spent on the board at the PRI, and since 1983 he's promoted responsible investment, generating research with for responsible investors, and he's worked with others to build sustainable finance networks. So I think you'll agree with me, we've got a really great panel, and I'm so looking forward to the discussion today. So perhaps just before I get started with our webinar, I see that there's some more people that are logging on. I also have to say I was so busy chatting to Hannah and Peter before we started today that I actually forgot to share my screen and get going. So just give me a minute while I do the technical piece, and hopefully we can get started in a second. Oh, share my screen. It's not happening. Okay, there we go. So if I can just open this up. Are you all able to see that screen now? I hope so. And it should be in presenter view, which it isn't. Maybe this has been the delay in doing our webinars for the last month or so, is that the technicalities are actually proving, as they always do, the biggest challenge of today. And I think what we do want to do is get out of the presenter show and into the actual show itself. So sorry, just 1 second as I faff around with this. Now we're into Peter's screen. So how do I change this? Oh my word. All right, slideshow. Okay, there we go. Big deep breath. There we are, Hannah and Peter, for those of you who haven't already looked on the screen. And as I said, a recording will be available. And yeah, questions and answers are, of course, encouraged for today. So just very briefly about Ardea, we are a specialist consultancy. We work, support organizations internationally and across different sectors to help them meet their legal obligations and develop best practice procedures, particularly around business and human rights and modern slavery and supply chains. I am an environmental lawyer, so we have a background in environment, and one of the things we're particularly interested in is how we help organizations link the environmental and the human rights issues. And I think that in the context of what we're talking about today, that's going to become really critical for business as well. So our topic today is about respecting human rights. And I thought before we started, it might be useful to just tease out a few key principles. Human rights standards, as most of you might know, are established by international agreement. They are, human rights are basic rights and freedom that belong to every person. And what we've definitely seen in the 21st century has been this link between business and human rights. But the protection of human rights has posed a real challenge to business. And And we're going to discuss that, I think, in a little bit more detail today and in this series that we'll be running over this year. But I do think that it's key as a principle for everyone to really be clear that businesses are not called to replace the primary responsibility of governments to actually take care of the human rights of the people within their states. And what we have seen, though, in this debate, this increased debate about the role of business in relation to human rights, is that there are many drivers that have shaped the external and the internal responses to environmental, social, and governance issues. And over this past 15 years, we've seen these drivers that have caused business to start having to take account far more around how they are managing the environmental and their human rights impacts. And examples of this have been, you know, on a voluntary side of things, for a desire by business to do better under what was always termed corporate social responsibility, and the requirement to have a license to operate. But we've also seen the rise of voluntary frameworks like the UN Global Compact, the SDGs, we're going to talk about the UNGPs, the impact of climate change, the rise in modern slavery, and the real increasing focus by consumers and people looking at whether businesses are being responsible. And that sort of greater focus of transparency is critical for business now, and to understand how they actually manage their impacts and how it will make them more resilient in the long term. So I mentioned the rise of voluntary frameworks to try and address human rights impacts or negative human rights impacts. And I think that one should also understand that the UN Guiding Principles, which is a voluntary framework, which was established in 2011, it was seen as a game changer. It is not something that has created new legal obligations, but what it has done is it set out really clearly the responsibility of business to respect human rights. And it captured that in a duty to respect. Why this particular framework has had such significance is that it really was also established to address that governance gap that we saw increasing, where whilst it is the primary responsibility of governments to address and protect human rights, we saw the imbalance that was created where businesses had more power than governments. And that governance gap has remained and in some places has increased. And because of the tension of this, the UN Guiding Principles were part of that solution to try and ensure that businesses were being held accountable, not through legal means, but through voluntary means, to actually manage their human rights impacts. So alongside the voluntary frameworks, the requirements, and the desire by some businesses to have established corporate social responsibility or sustainability projects, we've seen this growth in the law and the legislation in trying to hold businesses account around what they are doing to address human rights and environmental impacts. And this map is a good visual to just give you a sense of the kind of developments that have taken place over the last 10 years or since 2011 across Europe. This doesn't capture what's happening globally. Certainly when we talk about modern slavery legislation, we see that globally there is an increased requirement for businesses to report on how they manage their, or the steps that they take to manage modern slavery or human rights in their supply chains. And there are certain principles around these legislation that is particularly interesting, where we're seeing a move away from just reporting legislation to legislation that is requiring businesses to do something more, to actually have due diligence systems in place and to be able to demonstrate that they are taking action. And so last year in April 2020, the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, announced that the EU would put in place a legislative proposal this year in 2021 requiring business to actually carry out mandatory due diligence in relation to human rights and environmental issues. So the goal really of a human rights due diligence under the UNGPs, and actually also in respect of the kind of legislation that we're seeing coming through, is to ensure that human rights impacts are properly managed, and from a business point of view, to ensure that human rights risk is properly dealt with. And I'm not going to go into detail around how businesses are managing their risk, other than to say it's really critical they understand what it is, that they apply the right lenses, that they know how to assess it, control it, identify it, and review it. And we're going to explore that further in the series over this coming year. And finally, just from my point, before I'm going to move over to Peter, is one of the critical things that I think as a consultant or as a lawyer, one always is asked is, what is the competitive advantage? Why is there a need for business to actually demonstrate that it has a duty, or that it's carrying out its duty to respect human rights? And I've just pulled together a few bullet points of the things that are reported and the things that we've seen in practice about the competitive advantage that is gained by businesses that are actually implementing effective human rights due diligence systems. So safeguarding reputation is really critical. We see that there is an opportunity sometimes to gain competitive advantage. This is particularly true for businesses that are trying to sell services and goods into the public sector, where the requirements by law is increasing to demonstrate that they are able to manage their human rights impacts positively. It improves recruitment, retention, and staff loyalty. We see that it fosters greater productivity. It can help secure and maintain a license to operate. It ensures active stakeholder engagement, and it can help meet investor expectations. And I think that's a really good point for me to stop and to hand over to Peter, because I know that he's going to be talking about investor expectations within this context. So Peter, before, let me stop sharing my screen, or do you want me to pull the slides up for you? You're on mute, Peter. There we go.
Okay, cool.
Do you want me to pull up the slides for you?
That's managed to share, hasn't it?
Perfect.
Good. No, well, thank you very much, Colleen. That was a great summary of the legal background to all of this, that, as you've said, has been developing over the last decade and a little more. And thank you to everybody who's taking the time to join the webinar. It's a good group of corporate people, NGO people, investor people, so quite a lot of different perspectives in the audience. So yes, I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of Visuaris, now VE, which is a part of Moody's ESG solutions. So just to explain where we fit in, Moody's has several affiliates, majority owned, 427, which is an expert on climate and environmental risks, VE, which I'm going to talk about, and also within Moody's there are various ESG competencies. So within this overall Moody's ESG framework, we provide a series of things which I'm going to talk about in relation to human rights. So the reason that Moody's decided to buy into VE and 427 is because they saw the need to provide trusted insights and integrated analysis across the things we're talking about, the things Moody's looks at traditionally and so on, and see what can be learned by putting these things together. So we're combining a whole series of capabilities across those different groups to enhance what each of us could do individually. So that's what we're part of. Now, coming back to Visuaris itself, or VE as we are now, we've been around a long time. We have a quite large team of people with expertise across a whole series of different ESG areas. We see ourselves as helping to, as we say in the vision, catalyze the global shift to a sustainable and responsible financial system. So clearly today's topic, human rights, is a very important part of the catalyzing of that system. And you can see at the bottom the practical things we do. So we assess companies, lots of them. We help people create benchmarks. We provide data to people. We serve up various research pieces, and we can do analytics on the underlying data as well and help clients do that. So that's DE in general. Now let me focus on investors and human rights. So it's worth just quickly reviewing. I mean, there's a long history to investors being interested in human rights. South Africa, apartheid, a number of organizations in this field now were created at that time. But as Colleen's been highlighting, there are very practical things. There are mining companies whose mines have simply had to stop operating because of conflict. There have been major reputational issues when companies get involved in genocide or have stories of child labor splashed across the newspapers. And as Colleen was also highlighting, the regulation is toughening up. So we have not only OECD guidelines setting out investors' responsibilities for due diligence, but also now the mandatory human rights due diligence proposal that's working its way through the EU. It is worth stressing just how diverse the issues of human rights can be. So it isn't all about mines and conflict. There's a whole range, which I've listed here. Companies can be involved in very many different ways in different human rights. But investors do often approach this sector by sector because there's common issues within sectors. And also, if you're comparing companies as an investor, it's easier to compare one oil company with another than it would be to compare an oil company with a food company, for example. So investors' interest is also dynamic, it's growing. 2017, I think it was, 88 investors supported a statement backing the UN Guiding Principles Reporting Framework and the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark as vehicles to take this agenda forward. But now we have the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, which has 160 institutions, 5 trillion of assets. And you see at the bottom the picture of PRI's plan, the PRI, the Principles for Reporting for Responsible Investment, which gathers together more than half of all the globally managed assets in asset owners and asset managers. And you can see here their 5-year plan to make the guiding principles and human rights as big a part of responsible investment as things like climate are today. So it's gone a long way and it's going a long way further. What are investors actually trying to do with ESG generally and this area in particular? So it's partly about trying to reduce individual asset risk. So if there are risks being taken, as Colleen was mentioning, and they could be controlled, that would be better for the investor. It's also about finding the companies who will do best. So if there are companies who can operate in challenging human rights situations successfully, then they may have access to opportunities that others don't have. Equally, if people mess it up, that won't go too well. So it can be about picking winners. Engagement is also about trying to improve the quality of existing assets. So helping the company tackle these issues better, or in some cases just supporting the work that companies full well want to do themselves in the field. But there's an increasing focus also on market-wide systemic ESG risks. So climate change is the one that everybody talks about, but this means where things just don't add up. You can't get your long-term sustainable wealth creation because of certain dynamics that are going on in the market at present. And you need to stand back and say, okay, what do we do about this? How do we move the whole situation forward? On climate change, that's what's led investors to talk to regulators about what they do and so forth. Increasingly, investors are paying attention to their own clients. So within investors, you have the asset managers, whose clients are the asset owners. And the PRI itself is a model based on the asset owners requiring things of the asset managers. But those asset owners themselves are facing increasing interest from their beneficiaries and thinking increasingly about the world into which people will retire when they cash in their pension fund. So they're becoming accountable more broadly as well. And of course, there are wider societal expectations. So this regulation that we're talking about cuts across everybody and is something that investors have to think about because they have to maintain their license to operate as well. Okay, so when you come to human rights, it's part of social, and there's a big conversation going on about how social is the poor relation, if you like, in ESG. Putting more S in ESG is what everyone's speaking about. The thing about social is, compare it with environment. With environment, quite a lot of what you're looking at is what inputs you've bought for a process, what emissions you have, what damage your products do, what energy you consume, and so on. Social isn't directly about all of those, although the supply chain obviously is a key part of it, but it's much more about the people in the business and how you manage them and how they impact on other people. So it's, in theory, you can say that the clearer standards are there in the environment, but actually as you can see here from the norms and value, the social standards are a lot better established. They've been there a very long time, for over 100 years in the case of ILO labour standards. And it's not that there's some huge doubt about what those standards are. The challenge is to apply them to company operations. And Colleen's mentioning the guiding principles as a key way of trying to resolve that. So the way we set about this is, okay, we're trying to build a standard in the social field, in this case for human rights. So we look at all those norms and standards that are out there, and I've listed a few here, but there's another 31 I can't put on the screen. So we work through all of these and we try to say, okay, what does that mean for business activity? And on the right-hand side, I've just set out an example, the non-discrimination one. So these are the principles we've extracted from those norms that can be applied to companies. So you commit to the principle of non-discrimination and diversity. You identify which groups might be discriminated against. You think about when they might be discriminated, hiring, promotion, etc. You set targets for increasing your diversity. You track the diversity over time, and you address any complaints that come up. So these are the practical things we've derived from those well-agreed norms, and then we set about applying those to companies. So human rights, as I say, is part of wider social standards, but you see here like 5 of the big areas that we look at on the left-hand side: universal or fundamental human rights, union rights or fundamental labor rights, non-discrimination, slavery and child labor in supply chains, health and safety I've added here. It's not a core labor standard, but the right to life is obviously very important. But this also, they're quite well entangled with other bits of our methodology and our process. So you see other ones, I mean, labor relations, the actual implementation of those union rights, talking to your staff through unions or otherwise. Working hours is often a problem, particularly in supply chains. Responsible reorganization is about how you set about if you have to downsize or reorganize. And this is a big deal when you come to talk about just transition, because obviously a lot of industries are going to cease to exist over time. A lot of new industries are going to grow up. The process of getting from one place to another, people have rights in that process. So there are things that need protecting while that's going on, and responsible reorganization is part of that. I've put career development here as well for the same reason, because if people are going to have, you know, life change, careers changing several times in their life with various transitions, then it's a related issue. But the rest of what I'm talking about, I'm really going to concentrate on the ones on the left. And we set about building a social standard by thinking, as I was saying, it's all about the people, basically. So you start with the leadership. What do you expect from the board? What is the tone from the top? How is that developed? I think Hannah will talk a bit about culture. You know, can you detect that this seems to be something that's involving everybody, or is it just something that was written out in order to meet a particular deadline or something? So there's that leadership bit, then there's the implementation, which is how is this rolled out across your team, all the practical management systems you might have to have. In different areas, there are specific elements we'd look for. And then in practice, what is the results? What are the impact on the stakeholders? Do we have allegations or controversies? How have you dealt with those? So we then have to assemble all these different things into producing an opinion about a company. So we do that, weighting them according to materiality. So we could talk about materiality in relation to human rights, because obviously there's the concept of salience, that the big focus in the GPs is about what is your impact on the world. This is a product for investors and stakeholders that we're talking about. So we look at both. We look at what's the impact on companies, what's the impact on stakeholders, and decide for each factor that we're looking at how important it is for a particular sector. Colleen's list of all the reasons companies might do it, might do human rights, is quite well correlated with the business impact assessment that we make in that process. You see here listed the 4 particular things we focus on. When it comes to those controversies, we use the GP's scale, scope, remediability concept to identify whether the particular controversy is a big deal for the stakeholder or whether it's a big deal for the company. 6 different measures, and we put that together to decide how severe the controversy is. And then we look at what the company does to respond. So we have a scale that starts with silence, no apparent response at all the way through to remedying whatever went wrong, putting it right, and learning in the future how to avoid similar things happening again. So that's the framework we've generated to take the principles we derive from the norms and then apply them to the companies. So what have we found as we've done this? So we research getting on for 5,000 companies in full at the moment. The average score, the scores are all 0 to 100 in each of these indicators. So don't let anyone tell you you can't make it numeric if you have a proper scale to do that. Yeah, so the average was only 23.6 out of 100 across, this one was actually focusing on that first one, the fundamental human rights one. So not a very high score, compared with the average of all the environmental criteria we look at, 30, or the average of all the governance criteria we look at, 40. So human rights a bit behind. I took a sample of 1,000 companies that we've been covering for 10 years on this same indicator, and you can see an improvement. So you can see it up from 26.5 to 33. I mean, not huge, but still it's happening. There are geographical differences. So European companies are ahead, average 36 now. There's a bit of a difference between what I talked about, the leadership, the tone from the top, and the implementation, the managing the team and rolling it out. So leadership is ahead of implementation, which may suggest that people are a bit better setting out their commitments than they are carrying them out. But you'd want to go in carefully, sector by sector, company by company, really, to explore that. So that's kind of if you're looking at the whole data set, if you're an investor and you're trying to work out, have the basic data set on which you can build your particular policy. For each company, obviously, we can identify which of these indicators is the most material according to that 6-point scale of materiality I was talking about, and then how well the company scores 0 to 100. And so you can, as an investor or as a company looking at your own business, you can say, right, what are the issues where there's apparently significant materiality, but not much progress, and focus on those. Or alternatively, what are the things we're doing really well and how could we build on those for other issues? The controversies I've mentioned, so we cover a wider number of companies from controversies. The latest file I looked at had nearly 8,000 in it. So 2 charts here. One is how the controversies come out by sectors. So you won't be surprised to find that mining and metals is the sector with the largest number. Software and IT services, they're different types of controversy. They tend to be around privacy and that kind of thing. Diversified banks, specialized retail, which includes some sports where I think food, technology, automobiles, those you would kind of expect. It's sort of interesting that 42% come from all the other sectors. So even when you're out of the sectors that are big and famous, we're still finding allegations that we found high or critical, which are the 2 top scores out of our 4-point scale for severity. So it's quite widespread, the number of cases, although as you'll see, 1,834 out of 8,000, it's not like every company has a controversy on the level that we've rated as high or critical. On the right-hand side, you can see what I was saying, that we measure how companies are responding to these things. So you can see there's one bunch of companies who just don't respond to these things, nothing you can find publicly, nothing when we contact them that they respond on. So we just can't see, and it's not just us. I mean, we use Business and Human Rights Resource Centre public data as well, so they haven't responded to them. So that's a third of them are just not answering at all. 40% are answering, but that's really all you can say. And then when you get onto the responses that are really engaging with the stakeholders and the challenges, so the ones who put things right, the remediative ones, or the proactive ones who we can actually see are learning for the future. Now, obviously, in some of these cases, I mean, it's not that we can see everything that goes on in the company. We're based on public information and on giving the companies a chance to respond. So there could be things going on that Colleen or Hannah will talk about that don't necessarily come out. But from the point of view of what an investor can see, there's not a very large number that are really dealing with these controversies as well as they could. And for a lot of companies who've got a really good human rights policy, it often comes from some past disaster. So every one of these controversies is an opportunity waiting to be developed into a good human rights policy that would prevent risks and give investors what they're looking for going forward. So conclusions, yeah, I mean, that overall level of scoring isn't great. So there's a long way to go in meeting human rights, social standards. The EU work, others are pressing forward on this. So I say the external pressures are definitely rising. Investors will be a bigger part of that picture going forward. It'll be a while before you get as much trouble from your investors as a company as you do on climate change, but it's on the same trajectory. So you can kind of look at what's happening on climate change and think, okay, there's the future for investor engagement on human rights. Businesses are getting better at this. There are models of good practice, but it is from a low base. So Colleen was talking a little bit about kind of the business case. I think more investors are being drawn into this. I mean, the number of people who are talking about the S in ESG is very large, and human rights is often one of the very first things they pick on under that heading. So if you're not seeing it yet, you will be seeing more of it in future. There are lots of different links between human rights and business success, but they're very diverse because human rights are very diverse. So it's not like there's a simple relationship between the two, but there are very many relationships between business success and getting human rights right. So there is, as I finish, a strong case for companies disclosing better, which is going to be reinforced by regulation as well. But it's very helpful to investors and others looking at companies for investors if companies are disclosing fully on these issues. And just to explain in a way where VE fits in another sense, I mean, there's a lot of pressure to increase the volume of disclosure by companies, non-financial reporting requirements, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of pressure on investors to actually use all that data, and it won't just happen in between the two. So the intermediaries, whether they're the people who supply data on desks to the investors, or whether they're people like ourselves who analyze the companies and produce data and insights from that, it's a kind of rather important middle bit that that needs to be got right if we're going to end up with all this data actually feeding through and delivering the expectations at both ends, both on companies and on investors. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Oh, Peter, I've written down so many questions. I hope that if no one else is going to ask them, I've kind of have a chance to do that. So thank you for that. So Hannah, shall we move over to you? Are you able to pick up the screen share?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see that.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. And thank you so much, Colleen and Peter, for those fantastic insights and really great context to hopefully what I can now add in. So I'm Hannah Temple. I'm Director of Consulting at 2050, and I'll say a bit more about 2050 in a moment. For now, I'd like to just dive straight in where Colleen and Peter have skillfully left off. And just reflect, what we've heard from both Colleen and Peter is a clear message, no doubt one echoed by your own experiences, that businesses are facing and feeling huge pressure. Pressure to demonstrate that they are taking human rights seriously, pressure to demonstrate that they are fulfilling expectations, and pressure to demonstrate that they are living up to that responsibility to respect human rights. And sometimes that pressure is coming from governments in the form of legislation and regulation, increasingly hard law, as Colleen was alluding to. Sometimes that's coming from investors and benchmarks, as Peter was kindly taking us through, talking about the different ways in which investors are increasingly trying to tie access to capital to performance in this area. But these are not the only sources of pressure. There is a huge diversity of stakeholders and actors that are increasingly asking businesses to step up in this area. And so that can include, for example, employees who Colleen talked about. You know, they're really asking for, well, I want to work for an organization that aligns with my values. Industry initiatives are increasingly making it clear the difference between organizations that have advanced practices and those that have less advanced practices. Suppliers and customers are increasingly asking questions of their business partners to say, well, are you aligned with the work that we are doing? We need to be demonstrating our performance in this area, and so we need our partners to really be working with us. Increasingly, NGOs, the media, other civil society organizations have not only the intelligence, but also the technology to be able to investigate and inquire into businesses' performance in this area in a way that before now wasn't possible. It's now the case that an issue on one side of the world, it only takes, you know, one quick snap on a smartphone or one quick message, and that story is in the newspapers on the other side of the world. So we're in a completely different context now in terms of the pressure on business to take this seriously. But what does that mean? What's actually expected of businesses? Well, the good news is that the answer to that is quite simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. The simple answer, as Colleen and Peter have both said and alluded to, is that what's expected of businesses, whether you're looking at the UNGPs, the voluntary standards like the OECD guidance, benchmarks, regulation, investors, everyone is asking businesses to carry out what's known as human rights due diligence, not only in their own operations and activities, but also across the value chains that they're involved in. So I'm going to turn to what that means in much more practical and granular detail in a moment, but I'm just going to take a moment now just to explain who we are as 2050. So 2050, we were founded in 2004, and we are the world's first specialist business and human rights management consultancy. And over our time in operation, we have worked with many, many different organizations all over the world of multiple different sizes and types, all different sectors, and we've helped those organizations to implement human rights due diligence, from the boardroom to the factory floor, to the mine, to the field. We're involved in implementing due diligence across the whole spectrum of operations and value chains. And that work has really allowed us to identify and explore some of the key success factors that are essential if businesses are going to really succeed in this space, but also some of the classic obstacles that can get in the way and make it more difficult to progress with this agenda. And I'm going to turn to sharing some of those insights towards the end of this talk. For now, I'm just going to take us a little bit more into human rights due diligence and what that really practically means for businesses. So how different documents and standards talk about due diligence sometimes vary slightly different language, slightly different conceptualization, slightly different ordering, but broadly speaking, what's required in human rights due diligence is the same wherever you look. And the UNGPs is really the kind of bedrock of that. I'm going to use a visualization here that's actually from the OECD guidance. But as I say, what's here is the same as what's required in all of the other documents and standards, just maybe in a slightly different conceptualization. I'm not going to go into each of these different areas in detail because that would take us much longer than we have space for today. But I am just going to touch on them all and talk a little bit about the work that different organizations are typically doing in relation to these areas. But the first thing to point out as an overarching point is that this is not rocket science. This is a management system, very similar to management systems that organizations are used to using in all sorts of different areas of their business. We all know what a policy commitment looks like and what it does, and many of these aspects, and Peter very kindly in his example of non-discrimination earlier kind of talked through a number of these different areas of activity. But most of these things are not, fundamentally alien to us in our organizations, but it's just a question of how we turn that to looking at human rights in particular. So I'm going to start by looking at policy commitment, but before I do, one important caveat or point to make is that you can start anywhere. So a human rights due diligence system is not something that you start in one place and finish in another, and then you brush your hands together and pat yourself on the back and say, I'm done. Human rights due diligence, you can start anywhere, and it is an ongoing process. So you can start anywhere, but also there's no one size fits all. It doesn't look the same in every business. Every single business is going to do these things slightly differently, and there is no one way to do any of these things. There are better and worse practices, but there isn't just one way to do this, which I think is a really great thing about human rights due diligence in terms of its flexibility for organizations to make it their own. So turning to policy commitment, first of all, we all know what this is. This is about laying out your position as a business. Where do you stand? What are you drawing your main standards? What are you comparing yourself against? And what are you aiming to achieve? What's your goal? And typically speaking, the kinds of activities that organizations will be working on around policy commitment is really making sure that their commitments are in line with the most recent and up-to-date requirements and language that's out there. Really making sure that their policy document doesn't just say what they stand for, but also says how they intend to make that come alive. So some of the best policy documents are the ones that also include detail about the governance structure that sits behind it, the other different actions the organization is taking to make sure that policy commitment is actually realized. So the work that we often do in this area is helping organizations to make sure that their policy documents are as integrated, as powerful, and as practical as they possibly can be. The next area on the next kind of down and to the right is around identifying and assessing risks and impacts. And this is often a really big area of work. And, you know, again, speaking very much echoing what Colleen and Peter have alluded to, this is really about getting an understanding of where could there be impacts to people within the work that you as a business do and within the value chains in which you operate. And also understanding, okay, maybe where are those risks actually being realized? Where are they having actual negative impacts on people? So here is an important point to raise here is that what's something that's central to a human rights due diligence program is looking at things from the rights holder's perspective. So when it comes to risk severity, for example, or whether or not a risk exists, human rights due diligence calls on companies to think about that from the perspective of the affected person or people. So yes, the risk to the business is obviously related to that, but the primary lens through which risk should be understood and considered is from the potentially affected person. So when it comes to identifying and assessing risks, the work that's often being done by companies here is about getting a kind of more or less overarching or more or less granular view of these risks. So we work with organizations to undertake saliency assessments, help organizations to identify the key human rights issues that are really relevant to them and their business model. Risk assessments, which go to the next granular level and say, okay, for each particular aspect of our operation, or each particular country of operation, each particular product, depending on the lens, what are the specific risks and who is potentially at risk? And how do those risks compare in their relative level of severity, scope, scale, so that then we can prioritize where we start as a business. And the other big piece of work that's often involved here is impact assessments. So this is really where we go out and work with our partners on the ground to actually engage directly with rights holders to understand, again, from their perspective, what are the negative impacts or positive impacts that they are experiencing in relation to an organization's activities. And the other thing to say here, which is something that, again, Peter alluded to earlier, is that it's important when we think about risks and impacts, but also human rights due diligence in general, is that we're talking about the full spectrum of human rights. And although human rights tends to sit most naturally within the S of ESG, within the social topics, human rights covers all environmental, social, and governance topics. Corruption is a human rights issue. Climate change is a human rights issue. My right to health, my right to livelihood, my right to safety, my right to self-determination, none of these things are possible if I'm in a conflict-affected area or the sea level is rising over my land. All of these things are interconnected. So it's important to recognize that when it comes to doing a risk assessment, that should cover all human rights. Cease, prevent, or mitigate is really about taking action on the back of those risks. So that might be doing training for key groups. It might be setting up KPIs and guidance documents to help people in their work, establishing operating procedures for particular approaches. This is really where you're taking action as an organization. So often we'll work with organizations to implement training or to develop those kinds of guidance documents and processes. Tracking is really where you're monitoring to see whether and how well the actions that you're taking are having the desired impacts. Are they producing a better outcome for rights holders? The most common program people think of in terms of tracking and monitoring is audit programs. And audit programs can do many things really fantastically, but they're by no means the only way of tracking your impacts in your work. And indeed, they have some key limitations. So it's important to recognize that there are other tracking tools like worker voice technologies, storytelling methods, on-the-ground impact assessments that can also help with the tracking of whether or not these activities are working. Communication is where you talk about what you're doing internally and externally. The classic example here is kind of the annual sustainability report or that kind of thing, or your modern slavery statement. These things fall into the communicating bucket of activities. And often our work here is about helping organizations to think about the story they want to tell, where they can be really transparent, and pushing our clients to go beyond just measuring and reporting what they've measured, but to a measuring activity, but to go beyond that and to talk about the impacts that they're having, what they're learning, what didn't go well, what they're going to do differently next time. So we're really working with our clients often to push that communication, not just to say, well, this is what we did, but the so what did you learn and what will you do next time? And the final area, remedy, is okay, well, what do you do when something goes wrong? You know, that's partly about having grievance mechanisms in place so that you can hear if something goes wrong, but it's also about having really robust partnerships in place with good local on-the-ground organizations who can step in and help you to craft responses to issues that are really in the rights holders' best interests and have them at the center. And you'll see that rights holder participation is at the center of this diagram, and that's not by chance. And neither is the word participation, because it's not what human rights due diligence encourages organizations to do, is not just to inform or consult rights holders, but to engage them collaboratively in the process of each of these different areas of activity. There are a few more overarching points I just want to say about human rights due diligence, because this is all quite complex and there's a lot here. So there are just 2 points I really want to just emphasize about due diligence. One is that the main thing that's being asked of you as an organization is knowing and showing. It's asked of you to demonstrate that you know what's going on in your business and in the value chains in which you operate, that you are aware of where your products come from and where they go and who is involved and the potential risks associated with that, and that you show what you are doing about it. That's kind of the real crux of what human rights due diligence is asking of organizations. And the second thing that I really want to emphasize is that no one is asking businesses to be perfect. Human rights due diligence is absolutely not about perfection, because anyone who's been involved in this space at all knows that that isn't a thing, that isn't possible. Any organization that says, we've done it, we've done human rights due diligence, that's sorted, that is an immediate red flag to people like me and Colleen and Peter to go, that tells me that you haven't looked or that you aren't really sure what your human rights due diligence is, because organizations, we all know, are living, breathing, dynamic things. And so human rights due diligence must be living and dynamic as well. Every time you enter a new market, think about a new product, work with a new partner, all of these things involve different risks, and risks in different countries are changing all the time. So it's really important that when it comes to human rights due diligence, the focus for you as an organization is not on being perfect, but is on continuously improving what you're doing. So just on that vein, the human rights due diligence journey, the fact that this is a journey, this is not something that you ever get done, that you go, okay, well, this is complete now, we've ticked it off. This is a process, and I feel like the language that we use here in what this is the Human Rights Capacity Diagnostic, a tool developed by 2015. A lot of this language echoes the framework that Peter introduced about how they assess different organizations and where they are on that maturity journey. So you can see that we're coming from the same place, that organizations are in different places in their journey. And sometimes organizations are right at the beginning and are figuring out, well, we don't actually know what's going on yet in our system. And some are really in the leadership space. And what we see is, what that means in terms of that journey is that there's more transparency, there's more ambition, things are more integrated, there's more engagement. These are some of the signals of what it means to progress on that journey. But it's also important to acknowledge that you might be in one place in one part of your business and in another place in another. So you might have a fantastic grievance process, which means it's actually kind of in sort of proactive experimentation. But when it comes to your reporting, you're in reactive. So there might be lots and lots of different, it's a patchwork rather than an overarching identity. So now just to come towards the end, from our experience at 2050 of having worked with organizations for many years on implementing all of these different areas of due diligence, we've been able to identify a number of things that we think tend to signal, okay, well, this organization has a much better chance of progressing up that path, of being really successful, and some organizations really, are putting themselves in a bit of a tricky situation. Now, this is a long list, but I've only picked out a few here. So the first thing that I'd want to highlight is that it's really vital to take the time to figure out, first of all, where you are now and where you want to go before you dive in. It's really tempting to go, oh my goodness, there's so much to do, let's crack on, let's dive in, let's get something moving. But if you haven't taken a moment at the beginning to really honestly reflect on where you are as an organization now, where you've got more advanced and less advanced practices, then it's really difficult to actually know where to focus. And it's also really important to acknowledge, actually, what is the ambition? If you're at non-responsive at the moment, does it make sense for you to be in your public commitments aiming for leadership when that's a long, long, long way away from where you are? Let's be really honest from the top to the bottom of the organization about where you are and where you really want to go. Secondly, and this is often a scary one for organizations, is be as transparent and open as you possibly can. Our experience is that those organizations that really try and kind of control the story, that are very, very protective of the information that goes out, that are very cautious and kind of don't want to share anything until it's completely wrapped up and got a bow on it, they are much, much slower to progress than those that are brave enough to be honest, a bit more honest about where they have gaps, where they can't focus at the moment, where they need to kind of wait and work on something else first. Those are the organizations that, although they might attract some attention initially, they're also the ones that tend to attract the most support. These are organizations that are ones that are being frank and honest about the situation. And that is always met with support from organizations like ours and NGOs and so on. Third really critical thing, don't underestimate the resource and commitment required to do this work well. There are lots and lots of organizations out there that have really brilliant, lofty ambitions in their policies, and they have one full-time employee working on it who doesn't have any direct connection to the board. This is a really, really big piece of work, and it's really vital for you as a business and your future success. And so it needs to be resourced that way. It's also really important to not underestimate the relational aspects of this work. It's fantastic to see people diving in and getting really kind of hands-on in how can we design the best risk assessment here, how can we develop the best report, how can we develop a really fantastic grievance mechanism, and getting really caught up in, okay, well, what are our peers doing, what does good practice look like, getting all the technicalities right. But if they haven't engaged anyone along the way, if they haven't brought people with them who are actually going to have to use it or implement it or share it, then it tends to sort of only reach a certain place and then gather dust. So if you're designing a fantastic grievance mechanism, but you haven't engaged anyone, then lo and behold, you've got a technically brilliant grievance mechanism that no one uses. And so it's really, really vital to recognize that doing the relational work, bringing people with you, thinking about the heart as well as the mind, is as vital as all the technical work. Try and think as holistically as possible. As I mentioned, human rights is a hugely broad topic, and that can be overwhelming, but it's also a huge asset. Because what can happen is that you have an environmental team over here, a social team over here, and a compliance team over there, and they're all doing things in their own separate spaces and not working together, not connecting the dots, even though those dots are connected. And the best case scenario is that that's just not very efficient. And the worst case scenario is that you have actually different teams undermining the work of each other. And we see this happening really commonly. So it's really important, as much as possible, if you actually want to achieve results and get impact, that you think holistically and are not afraid to join up those dots. And the final thing I'll say, which I mentioned earlier, which is just so important, is that you must center the rights holders in what you're doing. It's really, really easy to go down a track and get completely caught up in us knowing what the right answer is and not actually speak to the people who it's supposed to benefit, not actually engage with the communities and the workers and the consumers that actually this is all supposed to be about. And if we don't do that, then there's really no way that these things can ever have the impact and the possible effect that they might do. So for us, it's really about, getting good value for your money, and really making good use of the energy and effort that you put in. If you don't engage rights holders at the beginning, then at some point you are going to find yourself unpicking the work that you're doing or having to redo it in a few years' time. So this is not a kind of moral, lofty concept. It's really about just doing the work well and getting good value for the work that you put in. There's many, many other success factors, but I think I'll leave it there for now. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. Over to you, Colleen.
Hannah, thank you so much. That was really so crystal clear how you explained human rights due diligence, a really complex subject, in such a succinct way, and I think, particularly bringing in your practical experience. So thank you for that, and Peter too. Actually, before, we've had a few questions in, but I want to sort of use my privilege, I guess, as a moderator to ask you a question first, if I can jump in there. I wonder if, Hannah, both you and Peter just want to touch a little bit on this point about leadership and cultural change. I know, Peter, you used it was really interesting seeing the statistics, how leadership was ahead of implementation. That was interesting. But I know, Hannah, in the same way that we've found that in our work, critically, cultural change, leadership is so critical to how a program is started and properly implemented. So would you just share with us, either one of you to start, what your own thoughts are around leadership, cultural change? How can some of the people who are listening to this today take something away, if they're not in positions of leadership, to actually help influence the changes?
Hannah, do go.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, a fantastic question, and so vital. I think there's a real tendency at the moment, and in general, to try and cushion our leaders from the issues that many people in organizations are very well aware of. So people who are within middle management, who are out in the field in different areas of businesses, they know well that there are aspects of work that are not known so well, or where they think that there are risks. But there's often a hesitancy to share this information upwards, to give leaders that information. And we often don't have the channels to do that. So I think one of the really critical things that organizations need to take very seriously is about how to get that vital information to the people who can unlock those doors and who can make the changes happen. Because it's that critical data about actually what's happening in the systems that is vital if leaders are going to actually be able to understand the size of the problem, the size of the opportunity, and really what's demanded of them. So I think thinking about clearly how to get information, how to get voices and data from all different parts of the organization into and in front of your senior leaders is a really critical piece.
And just to give a really very, very practical example of that, you're helping your CEO by doing that. If we think of, Vale lost their CEO in 2019 after the dam disaster. Partly, many things were done that were helpful, but it was the second time and it just didn't work. So, the one CEO went there. Rio Tinto lost their CEO last year. So, it's not that it's protecting your CEO to find ways of getting these issues to be taken seriously. So I would also say on culture that the investors play a very important role, and the rise of the finance director's interest in all these things is very important. So a lot of investors, particularly the long-term thoughtful investors, are trying to work out what is the governance input that they can make that results in long-term sustainable wealth creation going forward. So that's the puzzle that you have as an investor when you trust your money to this management, and you can't control them. You get to elect them perhaps once a year, but you don't have that much say. You can influence them as best you can. You can sell the shares if you have to, but you probably don't want to. So that they're very interested in how to get the right governance. And the kind of thing we're talking about are the signs of that sort of openness and thinking and continuous improvement and all that kind of stuff, which is a lot more persuasive than the kind of closed organizations that Hannah was talking about, to kind of have a bit of a stab at it. So I would say bringing the finance director in. Now, at the moment, we've also got the growth of green bonds, the growth of sustainability bonds. these are now new ways in which a company can actually raise their lifeblood capital from markets linked to social, environmental, governance things. So all of a sudden, finance directors, even if they weren't previously interested, have lots of reasons for trying to understand what it is that investors are after and what's going on. So I think there's quite exciting ways of getting that finance and that investor piece into this overall culture. In terms of our method, yeah, I mean, we've always been very keen on the kind of stakeholder way of thinking about a company. And that's partly how we built our model off the different norms. And so that whole culture that it's a company that's trying to make long-term returns for its shareholders, but it's in partnership with the stakeholders, and it's got to, the leadership has got to think about how to fit with all these different forces. And in a way, those long-term norms, I mean, it's a nightmare running a company when you know just how different people's opinions are. You look at culture wars, you look at social media, how do you know who to listen to, etc. And in a way, that's where we ended up looking for those norms that have been very broadly agreed as a kind of safe haven in a very stormy sea of working out what's a sort of safe set of principles on which to try and build a culture going forwards.
Thank you, Peter. That's really helpful too. I mean, we haven't got time to delve into things like fiduciary duty and some of it also how regulation might shape culture changes, compliance being one aspect of that, but certainly also drives change. We haven't got time to explore that all, and actually we've now run out of time. There are one or two questions that have come up, perhaps between us I could share them, and if you feel you can answer, we can try and respond offline to where they've come to. But I just want to say thank you so much, both of you, for such an insightful session. Thank you to all the participants who've been here listening. I see a very few have dropped off, and I've had a number of messages in the chat thanking us for the overview and for the insights. So I think it's been very well received. For those of you who are still listening, we will be running this series. We've got another 2 coming up in the next sort of 4 months. So just listen out or sign up to our newsletter on the Ardea website so that you can get the insights of what we're doing. Wish you well, wish you all safe days or nights or wherever you are. And we look forward to regrouping at some time soon again. So thanks again, Hannah and Peter, and have a lovely day.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. I'll take a picture.